So yesterday, during a lunch and learn that Rob Eisenberg was giving here at work, we were talking about constructors that could only be accessed internally. And this got me thinking about static methods on a class definition and what kind of access static methods might have to something like a private constructor. And in order to understand why this might be an interesting viewpoint from people who are not used to traditional object-oriented programming, people like myself, it's fun to look at an example like this, where we have class A, and class A has a private property message, and then we have class B, and class B implements class A. Now the nice thing, or the interesting thing about implements in TypeScript is that it can point to either an interface or a class, and in this case we're saying that class B essentially implements the API of class A the same way that it would implement an interface. But if we go to run this code, we might get a surprising error. So we'll call implements, and I'm running this through tsnode. And you can see that we get an error that says that class B incorrectly implements class A. And it tells us that the missing property message does not appear on class B. So TypeScript is essentially saying, hey, if you're going to implement class A, you have to implement the private property message. Now, when I first came across this, I thought this was really weird. It felt like a bug because everything that I know about object-oriented programming, which is admittedly not very much, says that private properties should be kind of part of encapsulation, meaning that the implementation details of what's going on inside a class should be hidden from the outside world so that I can change them without having to break the API contract of the class itself. So to me, if I implement A, private shouldn't be part of that. But it turns out that in traditional object-oriented programming, and this might be obvious to everyone who is traditionally trained, but for people like me, it's surprising that private properties are actually part of the class API contract locally to the class itself. And what I mean by that is that it turns out in an object-oriented programming language, the private properties of one class instance can actually be accessed by another instance of the same class. So if I had two instances of A side by side, one instance could access the message property of the other instance, which kind of blows my mind because I just had no idea that that's how object-oriented programming worked. I thought private meant private, but private means more like locally public and externally private. So coming back to the original idea of constructors and driving construction through private access, I wanted to see if static factory methods had that same kind of class local access. So if I have a private constructor, can I then create static factory methods which turn around and call that private constructor? And to make this demo just slightly more interesting than a simple A/B demo, I just have a couple of different static methods here, each that use sort of a different set of arguments and turn around, normalize those arguments, and call the private constructor. And then I'm just turning around and calling those static methods on the class and seeing what comes back. And if we run this one through tsnode, you'll see using .create, using .create for name, using .create from parts. Each of those static factory methods was able to turn around and invoke the private constructor on the person class, returning the person object. So as it turns out, static methods on a class can access the private constructor of the same class, in essence driving all object instantiation through the static factory methods. Now to be clear, I'm not recommending this as your primary means of instantiation. This was strictly an exploration of the access that static methods are granted on the class. Again, I'm not recommending that you do this. This is me trying to build out my mental model of TypeScript, which imposes traditional object-oriented rules, and I'm just not used to those, so I'm learning just a little bit more every day.